For this video, I'm going to be going over a basic inner tie rod replacement on a Chevy Colorado. Now this one happens to be on a 2021 Colorado ZR2 Bison, and the ZR2s in general have a slightly different suspension arrangement with longer control arms and also a longer tie rod end piece. So there are some differences in part numbers, but the basic process remains the same. How I discovered this was I was doing my King shock replacement, and you'll see that in the video. I started with my DSSVs and finished with the Kings. However, when I jacked up the vehicle and I checked the end play, typically something I do to make sure that the bearings are still intact, I also found that there was some play from front to back. Further investigation led it to be the inner tie rod, so here we are today. Let's take a look. The first step in getting the inner tie rod apart is to break the outer tie rod loose, and as you can see here, I've already taken the nut off of the outer ball joint. I will break that loose once we do a couple of things to the tie rod to get all the parts loose. I have also taken the link between the sway bar and the control arm off, and that does give us some space depending upon the removal tool of choice, and I'm going to show you two examples here. So let's get started with the removal. Next up, we need to remove the jam nut. In this case, I do have the Peak Suspension tie rod sleeve on there. That does take the place of the jam nut and comes off in the same way. Once that is loose, now we can break loose that outer ball joint, and just striking the knuckle will release it. We want to drop that out of place and, of course, take the nut off the top, and we're ready to continue with the teardown before we get to the installation. Now that we have everything loose, we want to back off the outer tie rod. And as you see here, you want to count the number of rotations as it turns back to the top position so that you have the exact number of threads that it takes. Now we are replacing this with a factory tie rod, so the threads and everything and the overall length should be very close. This should get us to about 99% of where we were at the alignment. Next up, we've got to free up the boot, and there is a simple pinch clamp here. You can use a set of pliers to pinch and pull that over the front of the boot. And then what I usually do is using the pliers and loosely gripping, just kind of rotate it on that surface to break the rubber free from the metal. We're going to have to use some lubricant later, but we'll show you that. Once we get that done, we want to get to the back, and there is a clamp, and this clamp is a non-reusable clamp. So here we're going to insert a flat blade screwdriver, and you'll see where the head goes inside of the pinch area. We're going to twist that to relieve the tension, and once we have that completely loose, you should be able to fit your screwdriver underneath there to make sure everything is released, and this will allow the inside edge to pull out and allow the entire boot to come off. Before we can pull the boot off, we need to remove the jam nut. In this case, it's the tie rod sleeve. I'm going to take one quick measurement of where the threads were last at. The countdown should be more than sufficient, but this is just another double check. I'd rather have more information than not enough when I go to reassemble. Now we can pull the jam nut or the tie rod sleeve off, and with the complete shaft exposed, we're going to remove that little clamp that we had jammed behind the jam nut. Slide that off, and it's a good idea here to apply a little bit of lubrication so we don't damage that boot. Spray the end and then gently slide that off. They'll have a little bit of a lip to pull on, but it should come off fairly easily. With the boot fully removed, I can now visually see what I felt, and that is when I pull on the tie rod itself, I can feel the movement in that ball joint. So here, just a confirmation that that's exactly what was causing the problem. Now we're ready to pull the inner tie rod arm off, and to do that, I'm using the tool that you can rent from your typical auto parts store. This has a device that clips around the back of the tie rod nut, and this allows you now to slip the main rotation device, which is a sleeve which hooks up to a 1/2-inch drive breaker bar or a ratchet, and allows you to turn that without having a whole lot of clearance from the underside of the vehicle. I did pull down that link from the sway bar to make accommodation for this, but I also wanted to show you an alternative method. In the case that you're doing a field service, you can just push the wheel to get more room, and there's actually quite a bit of space under the control arm here to fit a standard spanner wrench or even the proper size wrench to break loose the end of that inner tie rod. So if this is something more like a field service where you don't have that specialty tool, this is still something you can do out there with some basic tools. Go ahead and back off that inner tie rod, and now we're completely disassembled, ready for the reassembly. A quick look at our new product on the top and the defective one on the bottom. This is an exact replacement from the factory. Don't mind the perspective. They are entirely the same length and exactly the same construction. Now we're ready for reassembly, and we can get our new inner tie rod threaded into the rack. We want to make sure that you do so. Don't damage the threads. Get it bottomed out. And I'm going to use the same method I used for the final removal, which is the adjustable wrench. I'm going to lock onto the back of the nut, get that snugged up, and then one more good pull to make sure everything is nice and tight. Now we can put the old boot on the new inner tie rod. We're going to slide that over, and you'll feel that front little lip catch on the end of the boot. And once that's there, it might be easier for you to go and pull that rack back into the normal position so you're not trying to stretch the boot and get it to clasp on the inside edge. That simply means you're going to go to the other side here and push the tire, and this will allow you to have it clasp on with a little bit of force, but not actually fight against the fact that the boot doesn't want to clip on. Now you're going to slip the edge of that boot over that inner lip on the rack, and once you feel it kind of snap into place, we're ready to put the last clamp on there. Now the kit from GM comes with a non-reusable clamp very similar to what we took off. I'm actually using a field serviceable like CV boot or universal boot type of clamp. It's effectively the same thing, but doesn't require that you have the special crimping tool. Basically with this one, and this is available again at any other auto parts store, you're going to pull the stainless sleeve through the buckle, flip the buckle 180, and when it does that, it'll apply tension, and then basically clip the excess material and lock it into place. Once that's all locked in there, this is basically what it should look like. For final assembly on the boot, we need to put the last clamp on the outside. You can reuse the original, but the GM kit does provide you with a new one. Simply put that on over the end, make sure it's nice and tight. And then we need to get ready for putting the jam nut or the tie rod sleeve back on. I always like to use a little bit of anti-seize on this just to make sure nothing locks up. Put the tie rod sleeve or jam nut on, and then we're going to go ahead and put the outer tie rod back in place. And that simply means paying attention to either our measurement or the number of turns, starting in the same position and counting back that number to make sure we get our alignment as close as possible. Once that outer tie rod is in the correct position, we want to tighten up the jam nut so it doesn't move, reinsert the outer tie rod back into the knuckle, replace the nut, and you're ready to do the final bits of assembly, which I'm not going to show here because I still have to finish up the rest of the shock install. So tighten up your outer bolt to the maximum specification that the OEM recommends. Be sure to put your sway bar end link back if you've taken that out. But there you are. There's your tie rod service if you're in a shop or if you're out in the field.